At dawn, the cliffs of Amarna hold the light before the plain does. The limestone faces turn pale, then gold, then almost white. And for a little while it is possible to imagine why a king once looked at this empty curve of desert and believed it had been chosen by the sun itself. There is no older city buried beneath it, no ancestral capital crowding the ground with memories of earlier kings. There is only the wide bend of the Nile, the hard desert rising behind it, and the open horizon where the disk of the sun climbs without obstruction. This was Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, a city built in haste for a new god, a new court, and a royal family that seemed to stand directly beneath the rays of heaven. Today, the place is quiet. Mud brick walls have melted back into the earth. Palace floors lie broken under dust. Boundary stelae cling to the cliffs with worn inscriptions, as if the desert itself has nearly forgotten the royal command that once made this landscape sacred. And somewhere inside that fading command survives the name of a Princess Meritaten, beloved of the Aten, eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Her story begins not with a tomb intact beneath stone, nor with a mummy carrying her name, nor with a treasure chamber waiting in darkness. It begins with fragments, a carved title, a damaged relief, a face on a wall where the nose has been struck away, a name written beside a small royal figure beneath the long, thin hands of the sun. Meritaten is not lost because she never mattered. She is lost because she mattered inside one of the most unstable moments in Egyptian history. And when that moment ended, later rulers had powerful reasons to push it into silence. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The world we're entering is not only the world of a royal daughter, it is the world of a family turned into theology, of a city made from conviction, and of a young woman whose life is visible in flashes, then suddenly hidden. What survives in the record suggests that Meritaten was born into privilege so intense that it became almost unreal. She was not merely the child of a pharaoh and queen. She belonged to the household that Akhenaten placed at the center of a religious transformation, one that redirected official worship toward the Aten, the visible sun disk, and elevated the king's own family as the living channel through which divine light reached Egypt. In ordinary Egyptian kingship, the pharaoh was already sacred, already the mediator between gods and people. But at Amarna, that principle is sharpened into something stranger and more intimate. The royal family appears again and again beneath rays ending in tiny hands. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters are shown together, worshipping and occupying the visual center of the new order. Meritaten is the first of these daughters, and that fact matters. In a court where royal women are unusually prominent, the eldest princess stands close to the axis of power. Her name appears in scenes meant not only for private memory but for public meaning. She is part of the image by which Akhenaten explains his revolution to Egypt. Yet the evidence remains incomplete. Egyptologists can read titles and sequences of names, compare changing inscriptions, and trace the appearance of royal daughters across tombs and temples. But they cannot simply open a diary of Meritaten's life. They cannot hear her voice, know her private loyalties, or follow every step between childhood visibility and later political ambiguity. The surviving record is bright in places and broken in others, like sunlight falling through a shattered roof. The city around her is equally strange. Amarna was founded quickly, occupied intensely, and abandoned after a short life. Unlike Thebes or Memphis, where centuries of rebuilding blur one era into another, Amarna preserves the outline of a political experiment that did not last long enough to become ordinary. Its broad roads, palaces, worker villages, temples open to the sky, and elite tombs all belong to a narrow slice of time. It is not a city slowly transformed by generations. It is the physical trace of a decision. And the decision was radical. Akhenaten moved the royal residence, altered artistic language, changed temple priorities, and challenged the enormous religious weight of Amun and the old priestly centres. Scholars still debate the exact nature of his beliefs and how far Atenism should be understood as monotheism, royal theology, political centralization, or all of these at once. But whatever words are used, the result was disruptive. Temples are designed for sunlight rather than darkness. Royal images are repeated with almost obsessive intensity. The city seems to insist that the world has been remade. For Meritaten, childhood identity and royal purpose may have been inseparable. She grows up, as far as the evidence allows us to see, inside a staged sacred family. Her mother, Nefertiti, is not a shadow behind the throne but a force in the imagery of the court. Her father is the king who turns away from old patterns and binds his reign to a new divine horizon. Around them are sisters whose names also honour the Aten, small figures in reliefs, sometimes shown with the tenderness that makes Amarna art famous, sometimes arranged in ceremonies where every gesture serves ideology. It is tempting to imagine the palace as serene because the art can feel intimate. But ancient court art is never simple domestic memory. It is chosen, composed, and purposeful. The warmth is real as an artistic effect, but its political meaning is carefully controlled. That is one of the quiet dangers in reading Meritaten's life. The Amarna style gives the illusion of access. Compared with earlier royal imagery, it can seem startlingly human. Yet closeness is not the same as certainty. The images reveal what the court wanted seen. They do not reveal everything happening behind palace walls, among priests displaced by reform, or in foreign territories where Egypt's influence was being tested. No single explanation fully accounts for the atmosphere of Amarna, because it was at once a sacred dream, a political project, a family stage, and a functioning capital where scribes kept accounts, craftsmen shaped stone, workers made bricks, and households adjusted to a city without deep roots. By the time the modern visitor stands among the remains, the machine is gone. The Aten temples are open ruins. The palace pavements are damaged. The cliff tombs preserve scenes that are beautiful, formal, and wounded. Akhenaten's revolution did not hold. The old gods returned to public favour. The names of the Amarna rulers were later attacked, ignored, or folded into uneasy silence. Meritaten's own path becomes harder to follow, precisely when she may have been closest to power. This is the central tension of her story. She is everywhere enough to be important, but nowhere enough to be complete. So the first image is not a princess seated safely in gold. It is a name surviving in a city of light after the light has moved on. Meritaten stands at the edge of the record, not as a simple victim of disappearance, and not as a romantic ghost invented by modern longing, but as a royal woman whose life crossed the fault line between devotion and collapse. Around her, the cliffs keep their old shape. The Nile still bends below the desert. The morning sun still rises over the horizon that Akhenaten once declared sacred. But the city that was built to make that horizon eternal has become dust. And in that dust the lost daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti begins to come into view. The city that rose around Meritaten did not grow like most Egyptian cities. It did not thicken over centuries beside an old shrine. a trade crossing, or a sacred mound already heavy with ancestral memory. Akhenaten appeared with the force of royal will, set down on a clean stretch of Middle Egypt where the eastern cliffs curve around the desert like a natural frame. Akhenaten chose the place because, in his own language, it belonged to no god, no goddess, no ruler, and no earlier claim. That claim itself may have been political as much as religious, but its meaning is clear enough. He wanted a landscape without inherited rivals, a horizon where the Aten could be worshipped without the shadow of Thebes, without the old power of Amun, and without the slow resistance of temples that had been collecting wealth, land, and authority for generations. From the river, the city must have looked startling. Palaces, administrative buildings, temples, villas, magazines, workshops, and roads spread along the desert edge, arranged in a long ribbon between cultivated fields and barren cliffs. It was not a hidden sanctuary, but an exposed capital, designed for light. The great temples of the Aten were unlike the dark, enclosed sanctuaries of older Egyptian religion, where divine statues rested in shadow and only priests approached the deepest chambers. At Amarna, the sacred architecture opened itself to the sky. Courts multiplied, altars stood beneath the sun. Offerings were presented not into a mysterious interior, but under the direct blaze of the disk. The theology was written into the construction itself. The god was visible, and the city was made to receive him. For a royal child growing up there, the daily rhythm of power would have been marked by brightness, heat, ceremony, and movement. Meritaten's early world was not the monumental Egypt of deep temple gloom and ancient stone corridors, but a new capital still smelling of plaster, brick dust, fresh paint, cut wood, and hurried ambition. Workmen shaped mud bricks in the sun. Scribes recorded deliveries. Artists experimented with new forms. Officials followed the court because careers depended on proximity to the king. Soldiers, chariotry personnel, foreign envoys, servants, priests of the Aten, musicians, bakers, brewers, sculptors, jewelers, and labourers all helped turn a royal idea into a functioning city. What survives in the record suggests that Akhenaten was both visionary and practical, both sacred stage and administrative machine. The speed of construction is one of the striking details. Amarna was occupied for only a short period, yet the remains show a full capital with carefully planned royal and elite zones, working neighbourhoods, and separate spaces for people who served the court. The famous workman's village, set apart in the desert, gives a more grounded view of the system that supported the polished royal imagery. It reminds us that a city of divine sunlight still required rations, labour organisation, water carriers, animal dung for fuel, storage jars, tools, repairs, and ordinary fatigue. The Aten might shine from heaven, but brick still had to be made by hand. This contrast matters because the Amarna court often presents itself as if everything flows effortlessly from the sun to the king to the queen, and from the royal family to Egypt. Reliefs show worship, offerings, reward ceremonies, and moments of palace intimacy, all arranged beneath rays ending in small hands. But behind those scenes was a population adapting to an artificial capital with urgent demands. Scholars still debate how voluntary the move felt to different groups within Egypt, and how deeply Akhenaten's religious program penetrated beyond the court. It is possible that many officials learned the language of the new theology, because survival required it. while older habits continued quietly elsewhere. The evidence remains incomplete, and Amarna itself, though unusually revealing, cannot tell us what every Egyptian believed. Still, inside the city, belief and royal authority were hard to separate. Akhenaten did not merely build temples to the Aten, he reorganized the public image of kingship around his own access to the god. The king and Nefertiti appear repeatedly as the central worshippers, and the royal daughters, including Meritaten, are placed within that sacred visual order. The family is not decorative, it is part of the message. This makes Meritaten's childhood unusual in Egyptian history. Many princesses were born into palaces, but few were displayed so insistently as living elements of a religious revolution. Her presence in the new capital was not simply private, it helped define what the new capital meant. The city's very name, Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, carries the sense of a cosmic threshold. The horizon was not just a line in the distance. In Egyptian thought, it could be a place of divine emergence, the zone where the sun appeared and disappeared, where daily renewal became visible. By claiming this landscape as the Aten's horizon, Akhenaten transformed geography into theology. The cliffs, the river, the desert road, the open temples, and the palace balconies all became parts of a sacred theatre. Every sunrise could be read as confirmation. Every ceremony beneath the disk could be presented as harmony between heaven and throne. Yet there is an unease beneath the brightness. Cities built quickly for one ruler's vision can be powerful, but they can also be fragile. They depend on the continuing authority of the person who imagined them. Akhenaten had little time to develop the layered resilience of older capitals. Its sacred identity was tied closely to Akhenaten himself, and that meant its future was tied to the fate of his reforms. For Meritaten, this meant that home was also a wager. The streets, temples, palaces, gardens, and painted rooms around her were physical proof of her father's certainty. But they were not proof that Egypt would accept that certainty forever. One can imagine the royal road through the city, broad and formal, carrying processions between palace and temple. The king and queen appear in scenes riding together, receiving tribute, presenting offerings, rewarding officials. The Aten shines above them with the same repeated intensity, as though the art is trying to make doubt impossible by overwhelming the eye. Meritaten's world is shaped by repetition: the sun disk, the royal cartouches, the elongated figures of the Amarna style, the open-handed rays, the offering tables piled with food, the visible bodies of the royal family. Repetition is a kind of persuasion. It tells the viewer that this is the order of the universe. But history is rarely persuaded for long by images alone. Outside the carefully composed surfaces, Egypt still had old temples, old priesthoods, old festivals, old memories, and old expectations of what a pharaoh should preserve. Akhenaten could build a new horizon, but he could not entirely erase the country that surrounded it. That tension would one day close around his family. For the moment, though, in the early life of Meritaten, Akhenaten stands alive under the sun, a new capital blazing with conviction, filled with builders and officials, sacred altars and palace rooms, royal ceremonies and ordinary labour, all arranged around the belief that Egypt had entered a different age. And at the centre of that age is a young princess growing up in a city that is itself a message. Before her name becomes tangled in questions of succession, marriage, erasure, and disappearance, Meritaten belongs to this constructed horizon. She is formed by a place where politics wears the face of religion, where family becomes public theology, and where the sun is not merely above the city but written into every wall, road, and ritual. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is that the brighter the city seems in its own art, the more haunting its ruins become. Akhenaten was built to make the Aten's light permanent. Instead, it left behind one of ancient Egypt's most vivid examples of how quickly a sacred world can be made and how quietly it can be left to the desert. Meritaten's identity is both clear and elusive, which is exactly what makes her so compelling. She's not a figure invented from silence. Her name is real. Her place in the Amarna royal family is real, and her prominence is visible across the surviving record. Yet the closer one looks at her, the more the edges begin to blur. She is known as the eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, born into the new religious language of the Aten, and her name itself carries that devotion. Meritaten means, in essence, beloved of the Aten. It is not a casual name. It is a statement of belonging, a small royal theology compressed into a personal identity. Before she acts, before she holds titles, before later generations attempt to erase the world that created her, her very name places her inside the light of her father's revolution. Royal names in ancient Egypt were never merely labels. They could express devotion, legitimacy, divine favour, and political intent. In Meritaten's case, the name binds her to the Aten in a way that reflects the atmosphere of her family's court. Her sisters also bear Aten names, and together they become part of a deliberate pattern. The daughters are not just children appearing by chance in palace scenes. They are named, displayed, and arranged as living signs of the new order. Their existence helps present Akhenaten's household as a sacred unit, bathed in the Aten's rays and set apart from ordinary royal families. What survives in the record suggests that Meritaten, as eldest daughter, occupied the most senior position among these princesses, and that seniority gave her a visibility greater than that of many royal daughters before her. She appears first as a child, but never only as a child in the simple modern sense. She's a princess within a dynasty, and dynastic children carry meaning before they can carry policy. In royal art, her small figure can stand beside Akhenaten and Nefertiti, or near her sisters, beneath the descending rays of the sun disk. Her youth is visible, yet the scenes are political. The family is shown not because the court suddenly developed a casual fondness for domestic snapshots, but because the royal household had become central to how Atenism presented itself. This is one of the great surprises of Amarna. The art can feel tender, even startlingly intimate, with parents and daughters shown in ways that seem less stiff than older royal conventions. But the tenderness is also official language. It is intimacy turned into statecraft. As eldest daughter, Meritaten would have stood at the beginning of a sequence that mattered deeply in a royal household where succession was uncertain and symbolic order was everything. The full list of Akhenaten and Nefertiti's daughters is known from inscriptions Meritaten, Meketaten, Ankasenpaten, Neferneferuaten Tasherit, Neferneferura, and Setepenre. Their names appear in changing combinations across Amarna's monuments, and those changes are among the ways scholars reconstruct births, deaths, and shifts in court emphasis. The evidence remains incomplete, and the order of events is debated in places, but the broad picture is clear enough. Meritaten is the firstborn daughter, and she remains especially important as the Amarna story unfolds. Her mother's identity strengthens that importance. Nefertiti was not a minor queen. She was one of the most visually powerful royal women in Egyptian history, shown worshipping, offering, riding, smiting enemies in symbolic scenes, and occupying a space beside Akhenaten that can appear unusually elevated. The exact boundaries of Nefertiti's political power are still debated, but the images leave little doubt that the Amarna court wanted her to be seen as essential. Meritaten is the eldest daughter of this queen, and in dynastic terms that is significant. She is the child of the principal royal marriage, not merely one daughter among many from a secondary wife. Her bloodline connects the central king and the central queen of the Aten revolution. Yet it is important to move carefully. Ancient Egypt did not operate by modern assumptions about inheritance, family privacy, or individual ambition. Being eldest daughter did not automatically mean Meritaten was destined to rule. Egyptian succession could be shaped by male heirs, royal marriages, court factions, priestly support, military realities, and the need to present continuity with divine order. Still, in a court where royal women are unusually visible and where the later years become tangled with questions of co-regency and succession, Meritaten's senior status becomes impossible to ignore. Scholars still debate how much political agency she had, but her titles show that she moved beyond the role of a young princess. Among the titles associated with her, the most important is King's Daughter of his body, born of the great royal wife Nefertiti. This title establishes both her father and mother and places her within the highest level of royal legitimacy. Later, she is also attested with the title Great Royal Wife, a title that raises some of the most difficult questions in her life. Great Royal Wife was not simply a compliment, it was the title of the chief queen, the principal consort of a king. When Meritaten appears with this title, the record enters a murky zone near the end of Akhenaten's reign, and the strange, short-lived presence of Smenkhkare. Was Meritaten the wife of Smenkhkare? Was she briefly elevated as part of a succession arrangement? Did her title reflect a political necessity more than a personal story? No single explanation fully accounts for all the surviving clues. For now, before those later complications close around her, the title of daughter matters most. Meritaten's early identity is built through relation daughter of Akhenaten, daughter of Nefertiti, beloved of the Aten, eldest among the princesses of Amarna. That may sound limiting from a modern point of view, but in ancient royal ideology relation was power. To be the visible daughter of the king and queen was to embody continuity. To appear beneath the Aten's rays was to be part of the sacred family through which the new religion claimed to operate. Her identity was not separate from the public image of the regime. She was woven into it. There is a lesser-known strangeness here. For all her visibility, Meritaten is still physically unknown. We do not possess a securely identified mummy and cannot point to a body and say with confidence that this is the princess who grew up in Akhenaten. No complete biography survives. No private letter from her hand has been recovered. Her face, as seen in relief and sculpture, belongs to the stylized world of Amarna art, where royal bodies are elongated, heads and features are shaped by convention, and the line between portrait and sacred aesthetic is difficult to draw. The images may preserve something of individual appearance, but they cannot be read as photographs. The Meritaten we see is both a person and a royal form. This double existence follows her everywhere. She is human, but the record preserves her through ideology. She was a daughter who likely moved through palace rooms, heard temple music, smelled incense and roasted offerings, watched officials bow, and knew the heat of the Amarna sun. But she is also an image beneath divine rays, a name arranged beside royal cartouches, a figure in a family tableau meant to persuade a kingdom that the Aten's order had replaced the old one. What survives in the record suggests a life lived under constant symbolic pressure. Meritaten could not simply be Akhenaten's child. She had to mean something, and that meaning would only grow heavier. As long as Akhenaten's new world seemed stable, Meritaten's identity could remain radiant, ordered and dynastic. But the Amarna court did not remain stable forever. In the years to come, the brightness around the royal family would be shadowed by loss, political strain, and uncertainty over succession. The eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti would move from sacred child into a more dangerous role, one shaped by titles that still puzzle scholars and by a disappearance that feels too sudden for someone once so visible. At this stage, however, she stands clearly enough in the light Meritaten, first daughter of the king and queen, beloved of the Aten, a princess whose name still carries the ambition of a vanished city. Meritaten's childhood is unusual because it was not hidden behind palace walls. Most ancient Egyptian princesses passed through the record quietly, named here and there, sometimes shown in formal scenes, often overshadowed by kings, queens, and male heirs. Their lives certainly mattered inside the royal household, but the monuments do not usually make them central to the visual language of power. Meritaten is different. She grows up in public stone, in painted plaster, in temple relief, in the tombs of officials who wanted their own afterlife to remain connected to the royal light. Her small figure appears not as a private memory, but as part of the official image of Amarna. She is a child, yet she is already part of a sacred composition. The court lets Egypt see her because the royal daughters help complete the image of Akhenaten's world. The scenes are often striking for their closeness. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters appear beneath the Aten's rays in arrangements that can feel almost domestic. The king may be shown seated with his family, the queen nearby, the daughters grouped around them, bodies small and lively compared with the formal grandeur of older Egyptian art. In some scenes, the princesses gesture toward their parents or toward one another, their heads elongated in the Amarna style, their bodies rendered with the same flowing lines used for the adult royals. These images have encouraged generations of viewers to speak about Amarna as more natural, more intimate, even more emotional than earlier Egyptian royal art. But the evidence remains incomplete, and the warmth of the style should not be mistaken for a simple window into ordinary family life. The scenes are intimate because intimacy itself has become part of the royal message. This is one of the strangest achievements of Amarna art. It makes ideology look personal. Earlier Egyptian kings also appeared with families, but Akhenaten's court repeatedly places the family at the heart of worship. The Aten's rays fall not only on the king, but on Nefertiti and the daughters as well. Tiny hands at the end of those rays sometimes hold ankhs to royal noses, giving the breath of life. The image is tender and absolute at the same time. Meritaten, standing closest by seniority, becomes a visible recipient of divine favour and a visible participant in the family's sacred role. Her childhood is therefore not merely childhood, it is theology in miniature. In the palaces of Akhenaten, decoration reinforced the same world. Fragments from painted floors and walls show a courtly environment filled with movement, nature, and symbolic abundance. There were marsh plants, birds, pools, flowers, and river life. Images that brought controlled fertility into elite spaces. Some of these details can seem almost gentle compared with the severe political consequences of Akhenaten's reforms. A princess walking through such rooms would have passed through a palace designed to suggest renewal under the sun-bright surfaces, painted life, open courts, and carefully arranged luxury. What survives in the record suggests that the royal household lived amid beauty that was never merely decorative. In Egypt, beauty could serve order. A painted marsh on a palace floor was not just scenery. It implied creation, abundance, and the king's power to keep the world flourishing. Meritaten also appears in tomb scenes created for high officials at Amarna. These tombs are crucial because they preserve public ceremonies and royal appearances outside the immediate palace context. Officials such as Meria, Huya, and others decorated their burial places with scenes of reward, worship, and royal favour. The tomb owner's hope was clear to be remembered in eternal association with the king's new order. For modern observers, these scenes are invaluable because they show how the court wanted itself seen. Meritaten and her sisters can appear in these compositions, small but unmistakable, arranged near Akhenaten and Nefertiti while the Aten shines above. A royal child becomes part of an official's claim to status. To have seen the king was an honour. To be shown near the royal family under the Aten was to attach one's memory to the centre of the universe, as Amarna defined it. One of the most important ceremonial images is the great reception of foreign tribute, often associated with year 12 of Akhenaten's reign. In these scenes, representatives from foreign lands bring goods before the royal family. The scene is crowded with wealth, movement, and political theatre vessels, materials, animals, attendants, and foreign clothing carefully distinguished by artistic convention. The message is that Egypt remains the centre of an ordered world, and that distant lands still acknowledge the king's power. Meritaten appears within this royal display, not as a ruler in her own right, but as part of the dynastic body receiving the world's abundance. The lesser-known detail is how important such imagery becomes when compared with the anxious tone of some diplomatic evidence from the period. The art shows harmony and tribute. Letters from the broader Eastern Mediterranean world sometimes suggest tension, requests, and insecurity. No single explanation fully accounts for the gap between ideal image and political reality, but the contrast gives Meritaten's public childhood a sharper edge. She is shown in a world that insists everything is balanced, even as that balance may already have been under strain. Her visibility also has a ceremonial rhythm. The royal daughters are shown in worship scenes, palace scenes, and formal appearances, and the order in which they appear can matter. Meritaten's position as eldest often places her closest to the central royal pair, or first in the line of princesses. This may seem like a small detail, but ancient court imagery is rarely careless. Placement conveys rank, sequence conveys hierarchy. Even the scale of figures and the arrangement of bodies can carry meaning. In this visual grammar, Meritaten's seniority is repeated until it becomes part of how the viewer understands the family. She is not simply one daughter among many, she is the first daughter, the one whose later elevation seems less surprising because the images have already trained the eye to notice her. Still, there is a delicate uncertainty in all of this. We see Meritaten often enough to understand her importance, but not enough to know the texture of her inner life. The public nature of her childhood does not mean she had public power as a child. She was represented by adults, by artists, by court ideology, by the needs of her father's reign. Her image was useful before she could have chosen that usefulness. This is true of royal children across many ancient societies, and it should be approached carefully. Meritaten's presence in art does not invite speculation about hardship or danger. It reveals how a protected royal child could be turned into a symbol of continuity, favour, and sacred legitimacy. The Amarna style deepens the mystery because it gives the impression of movement. The princesses are not always rigid ornaments. They lean, turn, reach, and cluster. Their bodies can seem animated, almost spontaneous. Yet this spontaneity is carved and painted according to convention. It is controlled liveliness. Artists working for the court developed a visual language that distinguished Akhenaten's era from what came before and what would follow. In that language, royal bodies are elongated, faces can be narrow, bellies and limbs are rendered in ways that have provoked much debate. Earlier interpretations sometimes tried to diagnose Akhenaten or his family from the art, but most scholars now treat the style with caution. It is an aesthetic and ideological system, not a medical chart. Meritaten's appearance in this art tells us more reliably about royal representation than about her exact physical features. And yet, because the images are so memorable, they make her feel near. A name alone can be dry, a title can be formal, but a small princess beneath the sun's hands, placed beside Nefertiti in a court that seems to glow with open-air worship, leaves a different kind of impression. It suggests a life lived under constant visibility, a childhood that became part of Egypt's most daring religious experiment. Meritaten's earliest years, as preserved by Amarna, are not silent. They are almost too carefully displayed. The silence comes later, after the ceremonies, after the palace scenes, after the tribute imagery, after the family that filled the walls begins to fracture in the record. For now, she remains in the light, a royal daughter made public by a city that needed her image to help prove that its new horizon was real. To imagine Meritaten's life inside Amarna's court, it is necessary to look past the surviving outlines of walls and let the city fill again with motion. The royal buildings no longer stand as they did, and the bright surfaces have mostly broken away, but the remains still suggest a capital arranged around ceremony, administration, and the carefully managed display of royal nearness to the Aten. The day begins early because the sun is not merely light in this city. It is the visible presence of the god around whom the entire court has been reorganized. Before the heat becomes heavy, servants move through corridors and courtyards. Water is carried, bread is prepared, linen is arranged, animals are tended, scribes gather tablets and writing palettes, and officials prepare themselves for a world in which rank is measured by proximity to the king and queen. Somewhere within this system, Meritaten moves as the eldest daughter of the royal pair, protected by status, surrounded by attendants, and shaped by rituals that make private life almost impossible to separate from public meaning. The palaces of Amarna were not simply places where the royal family slept and ate. They were stages for power. There were reception spaces, painted rooms, columned halls, connecting bridges, garden courts, storerooms, service areas, and administrative quarters where the work of government continued behind the glow of sacred imagery. Floors could be decorated with scenes of nature so vivid that walking across them meant crossing painted marshes, fish, birds, flowers, and pools. This is one of the more surprising details of Amarna's courtly world. Royal luxury did not always announce itself through stone massiveness alone. It could appear as colour beneath the feet, as a garden enclosed against the desert, as a painted illusion of life in the middle of a city built beside barren cliffs. What survives in the record suggests a court that wanted abundance to be seen and felt, a world where even decoration participated in the promise that the Aten's light renewed creation. Meritaten's days would have been shaped by layers of attendance. Royal children in Egypt did not grow up alone, and a princess of her rank would have been surrounded by nurses, servants, female attendants, guards, tutors, and court personnel whose names are mostly lost. Their labour is almost invisible beside the royal images, but it made those images possible. Linen had to be washed and pleated, jewellery had to be maintained, cosmetics, oils, and perfumes had to be prepared, food had to arrive in proper order, rooms had to be kept ready for movement between private and ceremonial space. In the court's official art, Meritaten appears as a sacred daughter beneath the rays of the Aten. In the functioning palace, she also depended on an entire human network whose lives remain far less visible than hers. The evidence remains incomplete, but archaeology makes one thing clear: royal brilliance rested on ordinary hands. The food culture of such a palace would have reflected both privilege and administration. Bread and beer remained staples of Egyptian life, but elite tables could include meat, poultry, fish, vegetables, fruits, sweets, wine, and carefully prepared offerings associated with ritual. The offering tables shown in Amarna art are often piled high, almost overflowing, because abundance itself is a sign of order. To modern eyes, these scenes may look like ceremonial excess, and in a sense they are, but they also reveal an Egyptian way of thinking. Proper offerings maintained relationship with the divine. Food was not only nutrition, it was a language of devotion, hierarchy, and cosmic maintenance. For Meritaten, raised in a court where the Aten's worship emphasized open altars under the sun, the sight of offerings in bright courtyards may have been one of the defining images of childhood. Movement through the city also mattered. The royal road linked important spaces and allowed the king, queen, and family to be seen in procession. Chariots, attendants, guards, fan-bearers, and officials would have created a moving display of hierarchy. Dust rose under wheels and feet. The Aten's light fell directly onto bodies, vehicles, and polished surfaces. Public appearances were not casual travel. They were performances of order. Meritaten's presence in such settings would have reinforced the visual message already carved into tombs and temples. The royal family was not hidden from the city's sacred life. It passed through it, animated it, and made it legible. Yet the court was not made only of Egyptians looking inward. Amarna was connected to a wider diplomatic world. Foreign goods, envoys, and messages reached the Egyptian court from lands across the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean. The Amarna letters, written mostly in Akkadian cuneiform, preserve a remarkable glimpse of this international system, though they speak in the voices of kings, vassals, and officials rather than in the voice of Meritaten. They reveal requests for gold, marriages, military help, recognition, and reassurance. Against this diplomatic background, the luxury of the Amarna court becomes more than decoration. Imported materials, foreign objects, and tribute scenes helped proclaim that Egypt remained wealthy and central. Scholars still debate how secure that foreign position really was under Akhenaten, but inside the court the image of supremacy had to be maintained. Music and ritual would have softened and intensified this world at the same time. Egyptian ceremonies used singers, musicians, clapping, movement, incense, and carefully structured offerings. At Amarna, much of this was directed toward the visible disk of the sun, with the king and queen functioning as privileged worshippers. It is easy to picture open courts filled with heat and brightness, with priests and attendants moving among altars while the royal family appears in prescribed order. But no single explanation fully accounts for how this felt to those who served there. Some may have believed deeply in the new religious language. Others may have followed it because the court required obedience. Some may have done both, as people often do when faith, ambition, duty, and survival become intertwined. For Meritaten, life inside the court likely meant learning how to be seen. A royal princess needed posture, ritual knowledge, awareness of hierarchy, and familiarity with the gestures that made her role recognizable. She would have known the difference between inner palace spaces and formal appearances, between family grouping and ceremonial display, between being daughter and being symbol. The Amarna court's unusual openness did not mean freedom in a modern sense, it meant exposure. The family was placed under the Aten's rays again and again because the court needed their bodies to carry meaning. Meritaten grew up in a world where sunlight was sacred but also relentless. There is something fragile about that arrangement. The court tried to make itself appear natural, as though the Aten shone. The king received truth, the queen stood beside him, the daughters embodied continuity, and Egypt followed. But every palace needs storerooms, every ceremony needs planning, every polished floor has workers who clean it, every divine image has artists who choose its lines. Amarna's openness was carefully built. Its intimacy was formal. Its daily life was full of human effort hidden beneath divine simplicity. So Meritaten's courtly world was not a dreamy golden chamber outside history. It was a busy, pressured, beautiful, artificial environment, alive with ceremony and paperwork, sacred claims and household routines, foreign messages and painted gardens, luxury and labour. It raised her inside a system that made the royal family appear closer to heaven than any other household in Egypt, while also binding that family tightly to the fate of one king's vision. The same palace corridors that carried offerings and music also carried news, rumours, instructions, and quiet uncertainties. By the time Meritaten began to emerge from childhood into a more visible royal role, she had already learned the central lesson of Amarna light could glorify, but it could also expose. The power around Meritaten was not held by men alone, and that is one of the most important keys to understanding the strange shape of her life. Ancient Egypt was never a simple world of silent queens standing behind kings. Royal women could own property, appear in ritual, carry sacred titles, influence succession, and in rare moments even rule. But the Amarna court gives female visibility an unusual intensity. The women of Akhenaten's household are not hidden in the margins of the monuments. They stand beneath the Aten's rays, receive divine life, take part in worship, appear in ceremonies, and help define the public identity of the regime. Meritaten grows up not merely as a daughter of a powerful father, but as the daughter of Nefertiti, in a court where queenship itself seems to expand under the sun. Nefertiti dominates this world with a force that still feels startling. Her name means something like the beautiful one has come, and later fame has often reduced her to beauty alone, as if the famous bust from an artist's workshop could explain her importance. But at Amarna, Nefertiti is far more than an elegant face. She is shown worshipping with Akhenaten, presenting offerings, riding in a chariot, standing in formal equality of scale in some scenes, and appearing in positions that suggest a sacred role deeply tied to the Aten's favour. In certain images, she performs actions normally associated with kingship, including symbolic domination of enemies. Scholars still debate whether these scenes reflect actual political authority, ritual symbolism, artistic innovation, or some combination of all three. What survives in the record suggests that Nefertiti was not decorative. She was necessary. For Meritaten, this mattered from the beginning. A royal daughter learns not only from titles but from models of power. The mother before her is a queen who appears again and again beside the king, not as a distant consort but as a central partner in the new religious imagery. Nefertiti's body, name, and presence help complete the theology of Amarna. The Aten shines upon the king and queen together, and the daughters are drawn into that light. Meritaten's own later importance becomes easier to understand when seen against this background. She belongs to a household in which female royal identity has already been lifted into public sacred space. She's not stepping from obscurity into power. She's growing inside a court that has trained everyone to see royal women as part of the cosmic order. Behind Nefertiti stands another formidable woman, Queen Tiye, mother of Akhenaten and wife of Amenhotep III. Tiye belonged to the generation before Amarna, but her presence reaches into it. She had been a powerful great royal wife under one of Egypt's most magnificent kings, and she remained significant into her son's reign. Diplomatic correspondence from the wider Near Eastern world shows that foreign rulers understood her importance. That is a lesser-known but revealing detail. Tiye was not simply remembered as the king's mother in domestic terms. She was a political figure whose reputation crossed borders. When she appears at Amarna, she brings with her the weight of the old court, the prestige of Amenhotep III's reign, and the authority of a woman who had already learned how royal influence worked at the highest level. The presence of Tiye complicates the idea that Akhenaten's revolution was a clean break from everything before it. The new city claimed a new horizon, but it still depended on dynastic memory. Akhenaten was not an isolated prophet walking out of nowhere. He was the son of Amenhotep III and Tiye, heir to an immensely wealthy empire shaped by traditions even as he challenged them. Meritaten's world therefore contains two models of female power: Nefertiti, the radiant queen of the Aten revolution, and Tiye, the older queen whose authority had been forged in the older imperial system. The evidence remains incomplete, but this layered royal environment helps explain why women at Amarna could be so visible without appearing entirely unprecedented. Amarna magnified tendencies that already existed in Egyptian kingship. Then there is Kia, one of the most enigmatic women of the Amarna court. Her name survives in inscriptions and objects, though often damaged, altered, or replaced. She appears to have held a favoured position, perhaps as a secondary wife of Akhenaten, and may have been the mother of a royal child. For a time, she was important enough to receive distinctive titles and costly objects. Then her name was removed or overwritten in certain contexts, and her memory becomes tangled with the larger erasures of the period. No single explanation fully accounts for Kia's rise and disappearance from the record. She may have lost favour, died, been politically displaced, or been absorbed into later reworkings of monuments. What matters for Meritaten's story is that Kia reveals another side of Amarna's female world. Visibility could be powerful, but it could also be vulnerable. The royal women were not all equal, and their prominence did not protect them from uncertainty. Nefertiti's status appears extraordinary. Tiye's authority is rooted in age and dynasty. Kia's position is more fragile, and the princesses occupy a space that changes as they grow. Meritaten begins as eldest daughter, but her later titles suggest movement into a more adult political role. Her sisters, too, appear in scenes that bind the family together, though the record treats them unevenly. Some vanish from the imagery earlier than others. Some are known mainly through names and appearances in family scenes. The royal daughters are visible, but not equally recoverable. Their public presence was shaped by rank, survival, and the needs of the court's message. This female visibility was sacred as well as political. In Egyptian religion, women could embody divine principles of renewal, fertility, kingship, protection, and cosmic balance. Queens often carried associations that strengthened the king's relationship with the gods. At Amarna, where the royal family stands under the Aten as the central sacred unit, those associations become especially concentrated. Nefertiti may function almost as a ritual counterpart to Akhenaten, while the daughters extend the image of blessed continuity. Meritaten, as the first daughter, becomes a sign that the Aten's favour produces dynasty, life, and future. Her youth is not incidental. It is proof of renewal. Yet the same system that elevates these women also confines them within a narrow visual purpose. Their power is real enough to matter, but difficult to measure in modern terms. Did Nefertiti make policy? Did Tie advise Akhenaten in matters of diplomacy? Did Kia's position provoke rivalry? Did Meritaten understand herself as a possible political actor before the final years of the reign? Scholars still debate such questions because the sources rarely describe decision-making directly. Monuments show roles, not private conversations. Titles reveal status, not motives. Erasures reveal conflict, but not always its cause. The result is a court filled with powerful women whose exact agency remains partly hidden behind ceremonial surfaces. For Meritaten, this hiddenness becomes part of her inheritance. She's raised in a world where royal women are seen everywhere and understood incompletely. She watches, perhaps, the queen beside the king's mother honoured, another royal woman favoured and then obscured. Sisters arranged beneath the sun. She learns that visibility is a language, and that names carved in stone can still be changed. The public power of Amarna's women was not soft or ornamental. It was bound to succession, theology, diplomacy, and legitimacy. But it was also dangerous, because when Akhenaten's world began to tremble, those closest to its sacred image would stand closest to the break. The brightness around Meritaten therefore becomes heavier. She's not just the child of a radical king. She's part of a female royal network that helped hold the Aten's court together. Nefertiti gives the revolution its queenly face. Tia connects it to the imperial past. Kia reveals the uncertainty of favour. The princesses embody continuity beneath the sun, and Meritaten, eldest among them, waits at the point where daughterhood may become something more serious. In Amarna, royal women could shine with unusual force, but light in this city was never harmless. It named, displayed, elevated, and exposed. It made Meritaten visible enough to matter, and perhaps visible enough to be endangered by the very history that preserved her. Behind the radiant family scenes, pressure begins to gather like heat trapped beneath a roof. Amarna's art does not show panic. It does not show officials doubting the king, priests mourning lost influence, foreign vassals worrying at the edges of empire, or palace servants whispering about succession. Official imagery rarely admits that history is becoming unstable while it is happening. It prefers offering tables full of abundance, royal bodies under the Aten's rays, daughters arranged in order, and the repeated assurance that the world remains balanced because the king stands correctly before the god. But the surviving evidence, scattered across letters, damaged monuments, altered inscriptions, and sudden absences, suggests that the later Amarna years were not as serene as the art wanted them to look. Meritaten grows up inside a family that is publicly sacred, yet increasingly surrounded by political strain. The first pressure comes from the nature of Akhenaten's religious program itself. By elevating the Aten and reducing the public prominence of older gods, especially Amun, the king did more than introduce a new devotion. He disrupted institutions that had deep roots in Egypt's economy, geography, and memory. Temples were not simply places of prayer. They held land, employed workers, stored wealth, organized festivals, supported local identities, and gave communities a familiar rhythm of sacred life. To diminish them was to disturb networks far beyond theology. Akhenaten's new city could shine in Middle Egypt, but Thebes did not vanish. Memphis did not forget. Local cults did not cease to matter in ordinary life simply because royal inscriptions insisted on a new order. Scholars still debate how aggressively the old cults were suppressed in practice and how ordinary Egyptians experienced the change. But no single explanation fully accounts for the later reaction against Amarna, unless the disruption had been widely felt. For Meritaten, the resistance would not have appeared as a simple argument between gods. It would have formed the atmosphere of the court. Officials had to speak the language of Atenism. Artists had to carve the new style. Priests and administrators had to follow altered priorities. The royal family had to appear repeatedly as the blessed centre of the new system. Every ceremony reaffirmed the reform, but repetition can reveal insecurity as much as confidence. The more a regime insists on its truth, the more one wonders what doubts it is trying to silence. What survives in the record suggests that Akhenaten's court worked hard to make the Aten's order visible. That effort itself hints at a world where visibility had become necessary. Then there is the wider empire. Egypt in the late 18th dynasty was not an isolated Nile kingdom concerned only with temples and tombs. It was a major imperial power with interests in Nubia, the Levant, and the diplomatic world of great kings. The Amarna letters preserve messages from rulers and vassals who write about loyalty, rivalry, requests for gold, pleas for military support, and fears about local enemies. These tablets do not form a simple story of total collapse, and older dramatic accounts have sometimes pushed the evidence too far. Egypt did not suddenly become helpless, but the letters do reveal anxiety. They show distant rulers trying to hold Egypt's attention. They show the practical demands of empire troops, recognition, gifts, marriages, and intervention. While the royal art at Amarna displays foreign tribute flowing toward the king, the diplomatic record sometimes sounds less polished. It is a world of negotiation, complaint, and urgency. That contrast sharpens the mystery of the court. In year 12, a great public celebration presents an image of international abundance. Foreign peoples bring wealth before Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Meritaten, and the royal daughters. The scene glitters with confidence, as if the world is still bending toward Egypt's horizon. Yet around the same broad period, the surviving record begins to show signs of loss and adjustment within the royal family. Some princesses appear and then vanish from later scenes. Names and titles change. The family image that once seemed stable becomes harder to follow. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be wrong to turn every absence into a melodrama. In ancient records, people disappear for many reasons: death, altered status, damaged monuments, changing artistic programs, or simple accidents of preservation. Still, at Amarna, The pattern is haunting because the royal daughters had been so visible. When figures once central to the sacred family become difficult to trace, the silence feels meaningful even when its cause cannot be fully known. Disease may have been one of the pressures shadowing the court. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world was connected by trade, diplomacy, warfare, and movement, and such networks could carry illness as well as luxury. Some scholars have proposed that plague or epidemic disease may have affected Egypt during the Amarna period, partly because of references in neighbouring regions and the apparent losses within the royal family. This remains debated. The evidence is suggestive, not conclusive, and the exact nature of any disease cannot be reconstructed with confidence. But the possibility matters because it reminds us that royal ideology could not protect a court from the biological realities of an interconnected world. The Aten's rays filled the official scenes with life, yet the human bodies beneath those rays remained mortal. One of the most emotionally charged scenes in the Amarna tomb shows the royal family in mourning around a royal woman, often identified as Meritaten, one of Meritaten's sisters. The scene is difficult and has been interpreted in different ways, and care is needed because damaged art invites speculation. It seems to mark a profound family loss, while also preserving the event through the same formal language of royal representation. For Meritaten, if she was present in that world of grief and ceremony, the experience would have belonged not only to private family feeling, but to public dynastic meaning. Even sorrow at Amarna had to be carved into the walls of an official order. The royal family could suffer, but the image still had to speak in the grammar of kingship. Succession anxiety adds another layer. Akhenaten's male heirs are elusive in the record during much of his reign. Tutankhaten, later Tutankhamun, appears eventually as the young successor connected to the Amarna family, but his exact parentage and early position have long been debated. The lack of a clearly dominant adult male heir in the visible royal program may have increased the importance of royal women, especially Nefertiti and Meritaten. In a dynasty, daughters could matter greatly through marriage, legitimacy, and symbolic continuity. Meritaten's seniority, once a feature of family order, may have become politically useful as the court faced the question every monarchy must eventually answer: what happens when the king is gone? This is where the brightness of her earlier life begins to change colour. As a child, Meritaten's visibility affirmed abundance and divine favour. As she grows older, the same visibility places her near the machinery of succession. Her later title of Great Royal Wife does not appear from nowhere. It emerges from a court already under pressure, where the royal family's internal arrangements had become a matter of state survival. Scholars still debate the exact sequence of Akhenaten's final years, the possible role of a co-regent, the identity of Smenkhkare, and the changing status of Nefertiti. But Meritaten stands close to all of these uncertainties. Her name is not on the edge of the problem, it is inside it. The old gods are not yet fully restored. The city is not yet abandoned. The Aten still shines over Akhenaten, and ceremonies still present the royal household as the centre of life. But beneath the formal calm, pressures multiply: religious resistance, imperial unease, family loss, possible disease, and the gathering question of succession. The Amarna experiment has always depended on the king's certainty. Now that certainty must face time. Meritaten, eldest daughter of the sacred family, is no longer only a figure in sunlit domestic scenes. She's becoming part of the answer to a problem the monuments cannot openly confess. The family that once seemed to guarantee the future of Akhenaten's revolution is now being asked to carry its uncertainty. By the time Meritaten carries the title Great Royal Wife, the light around her has changed. She's no longer only the eldest princess standing beside her sisters beneath the hands of the Aten. She has moved into the language of queenship, and that shift is one of the most revealing and difficult moments in her story. In ancient Egypt, titles were not ornamental decorations scattered carelessly around royal names. They placed a person within the architecture of power. Great Royal Wife was the title of the principal queen, the chief royal consort, the woman whose status stood above other wives and whose role could help secure legitimacy, ritual balance, and dynastic continuity. When Meritaten appears with this title, the record is no longer showing a child of the Amarna household. It is showing a royal woman positioned beside kingship itself. The difficulty is that the title appears at precisely the point where the Amarna sequence becomes tangled. Akhenaten's final years are shadowed by unclear co-regencies, altered names, damaged inscriptions, and the brief appearance of rulers whose identities are still debated. Meritaten's elevation may have been connected to Smenkhkare, a short-lived king whose place in the succession remains one of the great problems of the period. Some inscriptions associate Meritaten as Great Royal Wife with a king usually understood as Smenkhkare. This would make her the principal queen of a ruler who emerged near the end of Akhenaten's reign or shortly after it. Yet even that apparently straightforward statement opens into uncertainty, because Amarna evidence rarely gives the modern historian the luxury of a clean sequence. What survives in the record suggests that Meritaten's role changed from dynastic daughter to queenly figure at a moment when the royal house needed continuity. That may sound simple, but the meaning is far from simple. If Smenkhkare was a male successor, perhaps a son or close male relative within the royal family, then marriage to Meritaten would have strengthened his legitimacy. She was the eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, the most visible princess of the central Aten household. Through her, a new or fragile king could attach himself to the core line of the revolution. In that sense, Meritaten's title may have been political before it was personal. Royal marriages in ancient Egypt were often instruments of legitimacy, succession, and sacred order. They should not be read through modern ideas of romance or private choice. This is one of the calmer but colder truths of dynastic history. A royal daughter's status could become a resource in moments of uncertainty. Meritaten had been made visible for years as proof of the Aten's favour upon the family. When the question of succession sharpened, that visibility became useful in a different way. Her bloodline, her seniority, and her name all carried political weight. To stand beside Smenkhkare, if that is indeed the correct reconstruction, would not merely make her a wife. It would make her a bridge between Akhenaten's sacred family image and whatever came after Akhenaten's failing or completed reign. The title, Great Royal Wife, also changes how Meritaten appears in the imagination of the court. A princess may be displayed as promise. A queen must help maintain order. She participates in rituals, appears beside the king, bears titles that echo divine and royal relationships, and represents the continuity of the palace. In Egypt's symbolic world, the king was never entirely alone. Queenship could support kingship by embodying renewal, fertility, protection, and the feminine counterpart needed for cosmic balance. At Amarna, where Nefertiti had been so visible, the role carried an even more charged inheritance. Meritaten's mother had helped define the royal image of the Aten. If Meritaten became Great Royal Wife, She stepped into a role already enlarged by Nefertiti's unprecedented visibility. Yet the evidence remains incomplete, and this is where caution matters. There is no surviving memoir explaining the decision. No inscription says, in plain human language, that Meritaten was elevated because the dynasty feared instability, or because Smenkhkare needed legitimacy, or because Nefertiti's position had changed. Historians must work from names, titles, scenes, erasures, and the relative order of monuments. A title appears, a name is paired with another name, an object is reworked, a cartouche is altered, and from these pieces a political structure is cautiously reconstructed. The result is persuasive in places and uncertain in others. Meritaten's title is real, but the full story behind it is not fully recoverable. There is another possible shadow over the title. In periods of royal uncertainty, titles can sometimes reflect temporary arrangements that did not last long enough to leave a broad record. Smenkkare's reign, if separate and brief as many scholars think, may have lasted only a short time. Meritaten's queenship, therefore, may also have been brief. A life that had been publicly displayed for years suddenly enters a compressed and unstable space. She becomes great royal wife, but not in the long, settled manner of a queen presiding over decades of monuments. Her queenship seems to flicker in the record, important enough to be attested, but too brief or too politically inconvenient to be preserved in full. That flickering quality is part of what makes Meritaten so haunting. She was not erased from the record before she mattered. She mattered, and then the record failed her. In the earlier family scenes, she is easy to place. She is the eldest daughter. She stands with her sisters. She belongs to Akhenaten and Nefertiti's sacred household. But once she becomes great royal wife, the clarity narrows. She is closer to authority and yet harder to follow. The title lifts her upward and simultaneously draws her into the fog of succession. No single explanation fully accounts for the surviving evidence, because the evidence is damaged by time, political reversal, and perhaps deliberate alteration. It is possible that Meritaten's elevation was meant to stabilize a transition within the Atenist regime. It is possible that she became the principal queen of a short-lived ruler whose authority depended on her connection to Akhenaten's main line. It is possible that her role was shaped by the absence, death, or transformation of other royal figures whose own records are unclear. It is even possible that later attempts to distance Egypt from Amarna made her queenship harder to see than it once was. These possibilities do not need to be forced into a dramatic conspiracy. The ordinary mechanics of ancient power are dramatic enough. A court facing succession will use what legitimacy it has, and Meritaten possessed legitimacy in a highly visible form. The human dimension remains quiet. Meritaten had grown up inside ceremony, but the title Great Royal Wife would have placed new demands upon her. She would have been expected to appear beside the king, to carry ritual meaning, to embody continuity, and perhaps to help reassure a court anxious about the future. The same city that had once displayed her as beloved daughter now needed her as royal woman. The Aten still shone over open courts, offerings still filled altars, inscriptions still claimed divine order. But beneath the formal language, the title suggests a shift from confidence to management, from celebration to survival. And so Meritaten's name crosses a threshold. She's no longer simply the lost princess of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She becomes a queenly figure in a failing experiment, a woman whose public identity was reshaped by the needs of a dynasty under pressure. Her title survives like a small gold object pulled from rubble bright, valuable and frustratingly incomplete. It tells us that she stood near the center of power. It does not tell us how she felt, how long she held that place, or whether she believed the Aten's world could still endure. By the time Meritaten becomes great royal wife, Amarna's horizon is still brilliant in the morning sun, but the shadows at its edges are growing longer. The problem of Kia and Smenkhkare enters Meritaten's story like a damaged inscription seen in angled light. At first, the signs seem almost readable. A favoured royal woman appears, then fades. A king with a brief and uncertain reign emerges near the end of Akhenaten's world. Meritaten carries the title Great Royal Wife. Names are altered, objects are reused, and the record begins to behave less like a clear line of succession and more like a room where several people have left in haste, each taking something and leaving something behind. For historians, this is frustrating. For the story of Meritaten, it is essential, because her own final visibility is tangled with these two figures, Kia, the mysterious royal woman whose memory was partly overwritten, and Smenkhkare, the shadow king whose relationship to Akhenaten's family remains one of the most debated questions of the late 18th dynasty. Kia's presence at Amarna is real, but slippery. She was not Nefertiti, and she does not seem to have held Nefertiti's supreme position as great royal wife. Yet she was important enough to appear with distinctive titles and to possess fine objects. Her name is attached to items of royal luxury, and some monuments or objects once connected with her were later altered for other members of the royal family. This is one of the lesser-known but revealing details of Amarna. Names did not always remain fixed on things. A coffin, a vessel, a relief, or a set of inscriptions could be reworked when status changed, when someone died, when politics shifted, or when memory became inconvenient. Stone seems permanent only until someone with power orders a chisel. Kia's exact role is still uncertain. She may have been a secondary wife of Akhenaten, perhaps a favoured consort within the royal household. Some theories have proposed that she was the mother of Tutankhaten, later Tutankhamun, but the evidence remains incomplete and debated. Genetic studies on royal mummies have changed parts of the discussion about Tutankhamun's parentage, but they have not given Kia a secure body or a fully confirmed identity. She remains a woman of titles, objects, and erasures rather than a person whose biography can be followed cleanly. What survives in the record suggests favour, then disappearance. The reason for that disappearance is unknown. Death is possible. Loss of status is possible. Political replacement is possible. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern. Meritaten's connection to Kia comes partly through replacement. In some places, Kia's name or image appears to have been altered for Meritaten or other royal daughters. That does not necessarily mean a personal rivalry in the dramatic sense. Ancient courts did not need private hatred in order to reassign monuments. If Kia died or fell from favour, objects and images associated with her could be repurposed for someone whose status better suited the new political needs of the court. Meritaten, as eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, was a natural candidate for increased prominence. Yet the act of replacement still carries a heavy implication. The Amarna court was not only creating images, it was editing them. This editing becomes even more important when Smenkhkare appears. Smenkhkare is one of those figures who forces modern history to admit the limits of certainty. He is attested as a king, but briefly. His reign seems to belong near the end of Akhenaten's reign, or just after it. He may have ruled as a co-regent with Akhenaten, or as a short-lived successor. He may have been a male member of the royal family, perhaps a son or brother, though the evidence does not allow easy confidence. He is associated with Meritaten as great royal wife, which suggests that her queenship may have belonged to his reign. But the surviving material is sparse, and the late Amarna period also includes the confusing figure of Nefertiti, a royal name used by a ruler whose identity is still debated. In this narrow corridor of time, names overlap, titles shift, and certainty becomes fragile. The reason Smenkhkare matters so deeply is that he may represent an attempt to preserve the Amarna system after Akhenaten. If Akhenaten's reforms depended too heavily on the king's own sacred role, then the question of who followed him was not ordinary succession. It was the survival of an entire religious and political structure. A new ruler needed legitimacy not only as pharaoh, but as heir to the Aten's chosen household. Meritaten's marriage, if she was indeed Smenkhkare's great royal wife, would have helped provide that legitimacy. She carried the bloodline of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She carried years of public visibility. She'd been shown under the Aten's rays since childhood. To place her beside Smenkhkare was to place the short-lived king inside the central family image. But the arrangement, if that is what it was, did not last. Smenkhkare's reign leaves only a faint mark. That faintness may reflect an early death, political reversal, later erasure, or the simple loss of evidence. Scholars still debate whether he ruled independently or alongside Akhenaten, whether his reign was measured in months or a few years, and how he relates to the female ruler or co-regent sometimes identified with Nefertiti. The names are close enough to confuse, and the period is damaged enough to tempt overconfidence. A responsible telling has to remain cautious. Smenkhkare was real. The clean story around him is not. The Kia problem and the Smenkhkare problem meet in the same atmosphere of instability. Kia's altered monuments suggest that status within the royal household could be reassigned. Smenkhkare's brief appearance suggests that succession was unsettled. Meritaten's title suggests that the eldest princess was drawn into the solution. The three figures form a triangle of absence: a favoured woman who fades, a king who barely remains, and a princess who becomes queen but then vanishes from the record. What survives is not enough to build a certain drama, but it is enough to reveal a court under pressure. There is also a human strangeness in the way material objects carry this confusion. A name scratched out and replaced is not just an archaeological clue, it is an act of memory management. Someone once ordered the change, someone carved the new signs. Someone decided which identity should remain visible and which should be covered. In the Amarna period, where royal identity was sacred language, such changes were not trivial. To replace Kia with Meritaten, or to associate Meritaten with Smenkhkare, was to reshape the visible family of power. The court was not merely recording events after they happened, it was continually adjusting how those events should be seen. For Meritaten, this means her rise cannot be separated from other people's disappearance. That does not make her guilty of anything, and there is no need to invent palace intrigue beyond the evidence. It simply shows how dynastic systems work. One person's altered status opens space for another. One death, one marriage, one uncertain heir, one failed reign can rearrange an entire household. Meritaten's later prominence may have been less a triumph than a duty forced by circumstance. The eldest daughter of the central queen becomes useful because the court needs continuity, and continuity in a crisis is often made from whatever fragments remain. By the time the names of Kia and Smenkhkare are placed beside Meritaten's story, the sunny confidence of early Amarna has become something more brittle. The Aten still shines in inscriptions. But the human order beneath that light is being revised. Kia's memory is unstable. Smenkhkare's reign is brief. Meritaten's queenship is visible, but difficult to hold. The court that once presented itself as a sacred family untouched by doubt now leaves behind evidence of correction, substitution, and uncertainty. That is why these damaged names matter. They show the machinery behind the image. They reveal that Amarna, for all its golden surfaces, was not a simple dream of sunlight. It was a royal house trying to survive its own transformation. A Meritaten stood close enough to the centre that when the structure shifted, her name moved with it. Beyond the walls of Akhenaten, the empire did not pause politely while Akhenaten remained the sacred centre of Egypt. The Nile still had to be governed from the delta to Nubia. Gold still moved from southern mines. Grain still filled storehouses. Soldiers still guarded roads and frontiers. Vassal rulers in Syria-Palestine still watched one another with suspicion, wrote to the Egyptian court, begged for support, and accused rivals of betrayal. The old machinery of empire continued to demand attention, and this is where the Amarna dream becomes more fragile. A city can be built in the desert according to a king's vision, but an empire is made of distance, negotiation, loyalty, and force. It cannot be held together by sunlight alone. The image projected from Amarna is one of confidence. Tribute scenes show foreign peoples bringing wealth before the royal family. The Aten shines overhead. Akhenaten and Nefertiti appear as the sacred pair through whom order flows, while Meritaten and the other royal daughters stand nearby as living signs of continuity. The message is unmistakable. Egypt remains the centre, and the world still approaches the pharaoh with gifts. But the diplomatic archive found at Amarna complicates that image. The clay tablets written in cuneiform preserve voices from the international system of the late Bronze Age, and those voices are often anxious. They ask for gold, complain of enemies, demand recognition, plead for archers, flatter the pharaoh, and warn of danger. They do not describe a simple collapse, but they do reveal a world that needs constant management. This is one of the great contradictions of the Amarna period. The court art insists on cosmic order, while the letters reveal political friction. A vassal ruler might claim loyalty to Egypt while accusing a neighbour of treachery. Another might warn that cities are being lost. Great kings exchange formal language about brotherhood while negotiating marriages and gift with sharp calculation. In these letters, empire does not look like a still monument. It looks like a nervous conversation carried across long distances. Scholars still debate how much Akhenaten personally neglected foreign affairs, and older claims that he simply ignored the empire are probably too blunt. Egyptian administration did not stop. Officials continued to operate. Yet the surviving correspondence suggests that pressure was real, and that Egypt's authority in the Levant required attention at a time when the king's energy was deeply invested in religious transformation. For Meritaten, this imperial tension would have reached the palace in filtered form. She would not have read the archive as a modern historian reads it, arranging tablets into patterns of decline. But the court around her would have known that foreign letters arrived, envoys waited, gifts were counted, and military decisions carried consequences. Royal women could be involved in diplomatic symbolism, especially through marriage alliances and public ceremonies of reception. Meritaten's appearance in scenes of foreign tribute places her within the image of empire, even if she was not making imperial policy. Her body, like the bodies of her parents and sisters, helped proclaim that the world remained ordered beneath the Aten. The problem is that proclamation and reality were not always the same thing. The religious changes at home may have made imperial management more complicated. Egypt's power abroad depended not only on armies and gold, but on continuity, prestige, and the sense that the pharaoh represented an ancient, stable order. Akhenaten's transformation of royal ideology was dazzling, but it also risked unsettling the very language through which Egypt had long explained its authority. Foreign rulers may not have cared deeply whether Amun or Aten stood at the centre of Egyptian worship, but they cared about access, response, gifts, and military help. Egyptian officials, meanwhile, had to operate within a court whose priorities had shifted dramatically. No single explanation fully accounts for every strain in the empire, yet it is hard to separate political uncertainty abroad from religious upheaval at home. There was also the practical issue of loyalty inside Egypt. The old priesthoods had not been built in a day, and they could not be erased from memory in a day. Amun's temple at Karnak had been one of the great religious and economic institutions of the new kingdom. Its reach extended through land, labour, offerings, festivals, and generations of devotional habit. Akhenaten's focus on the Aten reduced the official visibility of that old system and redirected royal attention toward a new sacred centre. To supporters, this may have looked like purification and truth. To opponents, it may have looked like disruption, arrogance, or danger. The evidence remains incomplete, because resistance rarely leaves monuments saying openly that it resisted. But the later speed with which Egypt moved away from Atenism suggests that Akhenaten's order did not sink deep enough into the kingdom to survive him. Meritaten's position becomes more precarious in this setting. Her identity is inseparable from the Atenist household. She's not merely a princess who happens to live during a reform. Her name, imagery, rank, and later title all belong to the reform's public structure. If the Atenist order weakens, her own symbolic world weakens with it. The same visibility that once strengthened her importance now binds her to a controversial legacy. She cannot easily be separated from Akhenaten's city, from Nefertiti's sacred queenship, from the open-air temples, from the family scenes later rulers would prefer to forget. This does not mean she was personally blamed by later generations in a simple moral sense. It means that her memory stood in the path of a political restoration. The empire cracking is therefore not only a matter of lost provinces or unanswered letters, it is also a matter of confidence. Amarna's court needed to believe, or at least to project, that the Aten's light had reorganized the world successfully. But outside the formal scenes, the foundations were less secure. Old religious loyalties remained powerful. Foreign dependencies required attention. The royal family faced losses and succession uncertainty. Smenkhkare's brief appearance, Kia's altered memory, Nefertiti's changing status, and Meritaten's elevation all point toward a court trying to manage instability. In such a world, the title Great Royal Wife may have been less a crown of triumph than a tool of repair. One can imagine the contrast at sunset. In Akhenaten, the sun drops toward the western cliffs, and the city built for its rising light begins to fall into shadow. The Aten theology celebrated the visible disk, the daily renewal, the life-giving rays, yet every evening the disk disappeared. Egyptians had older, just richer traditions for the sun's nighttime journey through hidden realms, but Akhenaten's official focus on the visible Aten made the evening feel symbolically sharper. The god who had filled the courts with brightness was gone from sight. The city had to wait for morning. In that daily vanishing there is an accidental metaphor for the Amarna Empire itself. brilliant, exposed, dependent on repetition, and vulnerable when the light was no longer directly present. By the late Amarna years, Egypt still stands, the kingdom has not fallen, the Nile still floods, officials still write, workers still build, offerings still rise under the open sky. But the experiment is strained, the empire's edges are noisy, the old religious heart has not truly died, and the royal household is rearranging itself in ways that suggest urgency. Meritaten stands within this weakening structure, close to power, but also close to danger. The city that made her visible has begun to lose its future. The court can still carve abundance on tomb walls, still show tribute before the royal family, still write the Aten's name with confidence. But history is beginning to move against the image, and once that begins, even a princess beloved of the sun may find herself standing in a light that cannot last. In the closing years of Akhenaten's world, the question of power becomes so difficult that even the names of the rulers seem to flicker. A king dies, or is dying, a short-lived ruler appears, a throne name surfaces with uncertain identity, a queen may have become more than a queen, a princess may have stood closer to rule than her earlier images ever suggested. This is the corridor of the Amarna period where certainty thins, and where Meritaten's story touches one of the most debated possibilities in Egyptian history, that a royal woman, perhaps Nefertiti, perhaps Meritaten, perhaps another figure within the family, briefly ruled or acted with kingly authority under a throne name during the unstable transition after Akhenaten. The problem centers on the name Nefertiti. It appears in royal cartouches and seems to belong to a ruler connected to the late Amarna period. For a long time, scholars have debated who this ruler was. Some identify Nefertiti with Nefertiti, elevated from great royal wife into a co-regent or successor who adopted kingly titles. Others have proposed Meritaten, especially because she was the eldest daughter, later great royal wife, and strongly positioned within the royal family at a time when succession was strained. Still others separate these identities more cautiously, arguing that the surviving evidence does not allow a final answer. The debate is technical, resting on names, epithets, altered inscriptions, and the sequence of royal titles. But its implications are dramatic. It asks whether the last defenders of Akhenaten's revolution may have included a woman ruling in the formal language of Pharaoh. Egypt had known female power before. Hatshepsut, more than a century earlier, had ruled as king, not merely as queen, presenting herself in a royal regalia and adopting the full titulary of Pharaoh. Sobeknefera had ruled before her at the end of the Middle Kingdom. Queens could be regents for young kings, and royal mothers could hold immense influence. So the idea of a female ruler after Akhenaten is not impossible within Egyptian tradition. But Amarna complicates everything because the court's female imagery was already unusual. Nefertiti had appeared with a prominence that sometimes approached royal parity. Meritaten had grown up as the visible eldest daughter, and then moved into queenly status. The royal women of this family were not hidden reserves of legitimacy. They were already public pillars of the regime. If Nefertiti became Nefertiti, the development would follow a certain logic. She had been central to Atenist worship, visually paired with Akhenaten, and elevated beyond the role of an ordinary consort. Her authority may have been strong enough to continue the regime, at least briefly, after Akhenaten's death or during his decline. Some inscriptions associated with Nefertiti include epithets that seem affectionate toward Akhenaten, suggesting a close relationship with him and perhaps support for identifying the ruler as Nefertiti Scholars still debate the readings and implications, but the theory remains influential because Nefertiti's earlier status makes such an elevation plausible. She'd already been shown as a woman standing in the light of kingship. If Meritaten became Nefertiti, the logic is different but still understandable. As the eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, she carried the purest visible line of the Amarna royal household. Her later title of Great Royal Wife shows that she had been moved into a role of adult dynastic importance if Smenkhkare died quickly, or if the court needed a figure to preserve continuity before the rise of Tutankhaten. Meritaten could have served as a bridge between the collapsing Atenist regime and the next ruler. Her name had been before the public for years. Her body had appeared under the Aten's rays since childhood. Her legitimacy came not from military victory or long administrative experience, as far as we can tell, but from dynastic symbolism at a moment when symbolism mattered intensely. The evidence remains incomplete, and this must be repeated because the temptation to make the story too clean is strong. Modern audiences often want one hidden queen, one secret pharaoh, one final dramatic answer. But ancient history is rarely so generous. A name can be reused, a title can shift, a monument can be altered, a throne name can belong to a ruler whose birth name is damaged or missing. Later restorations can erase the very clues that would have made the matter plain. What survives in the record suggests that a ruler named Nefertiti existed, that this ruler belonged to the late Amarna crisis, and that royal women are central to the debate. It does not allow complete certainty about whether that ruler was Nefertiti, Meritaten, or someone else. There is also the question of what ruling would have meant in this fragile moment. A female pharaoh, if present, may not have had time to create a stable new order. She may have ruled for a short period, perhaps as co-regent, perhaps as successor, perhaps as guardian of transition. The old image of a sovereign commanding decades of monumental building does not fit well here. The late Amarna ruler may have been managing collapse rather than expanding triumph. If Nefertiti or Meritaten took kingly titles, it may have been because the dynasty had few options, and because the legitimacy of the Atenist household had to be preserved long enough to hand power onward. That possibility gives Meritaten's story a darker dignity. Whether or not she herself became pharaoh, she lived in a court where female royal authority could no longer be treated as decorative. Her mother may have ruled, she herself may have been considered elevated or used as a stabilizing figure. Her title, Great Royal Wife, placed her beside kingship, and the confusion around Nefertiti shows that the boundary between queenship and kingship was under pressure. The royal women of Amarna were not merely witnesses to the end. They may have been among those trying to hold the end together. Yet the political reality was unforgiving. A ruler tied too closely to Akhenaten's memory faced a kingdom ready, or soon ready, to move away from him. The Atenist program did not have deep enough support to endure unchanged. If a female pharaoh tried to preserve it, her reign may have been doomed by the same forces that were already undermining the city religious resistance: succession, uncertainty, administrative fatigue, and the need to reconcile Egypt with its older gods. No single explanation fully accounts for the speed and complexity of the transition, but the direction is clear. The Amarna light was fading, and whatever ruler stood in it after Akhenaten stood in a dangerous place. For Meritaten, the disputed female pharaoh question is therefore less about solving a royal puzzle once and for all, and more about understanding how close she came to the center of history. She was not simply a princess who disappeared into marriage. She belonged to the final mechanism of Amarna power. Her mother's possible elevation, her own queenly title, the short reign of Smenkhkare. and the mysterious name Nefertiti all form a cluster of clues around the same crisis. The court was trying to answer a question it could not avoid: who could inherit a revolution built so completely around one man, one god, and one sacred family? The answer, for a brief moment, may have been a woman. It may have been Nefertiti. It may, less certainly, have involved Meritaten, or it may have been a more complex arrangement than the surviving record allows us to reconstruct. But the uncertainty itself is revealing. In the ruins of Amarna, the path of power does not pass only through princes and kings. It passes through queens, daughters, altered names, and figures whose memory later history tried to smooth away. Meritaten stands in that troubled passage, not fully visible, not fully erased, a princess close enough to kingship that the silence around her begins to feel less like absence and more like the shadow of power. The return toward Amun did not happen as a single thunderclap. It was not one moment when every altar of the Aten went cold and every old temple flame suddenly burned again. History usually moves more quietly than that, especially when powerful people need to survive a failed experiment without admitting too plainly that it has failed. The movement away from Akhenaten's world appears instead as a careful turning, a gradual reorientation of names, residences, rituals, and loyalties. The city of Akhenaten still stood for a time. The Aten had not vanished from memory. The royal family still carried names shaped by the sun disk, but the direction of power began to shift back toward Egypt's older gods, especially Amun of Thebes, whose absence from Akhenaten's official vision had never erased his deep roots in the kingdom. This shift is most clearly visible in the young king who follows the late Amarna confusion Tutankhaten, later known to history as Tutankhamun. His original name means the living image of the Aten. His later name means the living image of Amun. That change alone carries the weight of an entire political reversal. A royal child, born or raised in the atmosphere of Amarna, becomes the vessel through which Egypt announces that the old sacred order is returning. It is important not to imagine the young Tutankhamun as the architect of this restoration in a fully independent adult sense. He came to the throne very young, and powerful advisors, courtiers, priests, and officials stood around him. What survives in the record suggests that the restoration was a managed political act, guided by those who understood that Egypt needed reconciliation with its traditional religious institutions. For Meritaten, this transition is deeply dangerous in a symbolic sense. Her identity is tied to the Aten more tightly than Tutankhaten's eventually would be allowed to remain. Her name means beloved of the Aten. Her childhood was displayed beneath the Aten's rays. Her mother's queenship was built into the religious imagery of Akhenaten's reform. Her possible role beside Smenkhkare and her proximity to the disputed Nefertiti problem place her near the final defense of the Amarna order. When Egypt begins to turn back toward Amun, Meritaten is not an easy figure to repurpose. Tutankhaten can become Tutankhamun because he is young, useful, and politically necessary. Meritaten is older, more visibly embedded in the failed sacred family, and perhaps already associated with the succession arrangement that later rulers preferred to obscure. The restoration was not merely theological, it was administrative, economic, and social. The temples of Amun and other gods had once held enormous wealth, personnel, land, and ritual authority. Restoring them meant restoring networks that helped stabilize the kingdom. The old gods were woven into festivals, local identities, priestly offices, and the daily expectations of communities across Egypt. Akhenaten's Atenism had concentrated sacred access around the king and his immediate family in a way that was dazzling but narrow. After his death, that narrowness became a weakness. A kingdom cannot easily live for long inside one family's sacred image. It needs institutions that outlast individuals. The return toward Amun was therefore not only a rejection of Akhenaten, it was a practical repair of the structures that made Egypt recognizable to itself. One of the most revealing documents of this restoration is the language of renewal that appears under Tutankhamun's reign, presenting the old temples as neglected and the gods as needing to be restored to their proper places. Such statements are political texts, not neutral reports, and they should be read carefully. They exaggerate in order to legitimize action. Still, the message is clear. The new regime wants to say that Egypt had been out of balance and is now being healed. The implication is severe for Akhenaten's family. If balance must be restored, then the people most closely associated with imbalance become uncomfortable memories. The evidence remains incomplete, but the later treatment of Amarna names and monuments shows that discomfort hardening into erasure. Akhenaten itself loses its reason to exist. A capital built for the Aten cannot remain central once royal power returns toward the old religious landscape. The court shifts away. Memphis and Thebes regain importance. The desert city, so rapidly built, begins its long undoing. People leave, perhaps gradually, perhaps in waves, taking portable goods, abandoning houses, stripping useful materials, leaving behind broken pottery, tools, floors, and walls to the dry air. The city does not need to be violently destroyed in a single event to become dead. It only needs to be made irrelevant. A place built by royal command can be emptied by royal silence. This abandonment is one of the haunting features of Amarna archaeology. Because the city was occupied for such a short time, its remains preserve a kind of frozen experiment. But for those who lived through the transition, it was not an archaeological gift. It was displacement. Officials who had built careers around Akhenaten's court had to adapt quickly. Artists who mastered the Amarna style had to reshape their hands to older conventions. Priests of the Aten had to find new roles or disappear from prominence. Families tied to the city's service economy had to move or lose support. No single explanation fully accounts for every individual fate, but the pattern is unmistakable. The sunlit horizon that promised permanence became a temporary address. Meritaten's own place in this return is uncertain, and that uncertainty may be meaningful. If she were alive during the early restoration, her options would have been limited by politics. She could not easily become a public symbol of renewed Amun worship without some transformation of identity. And there is no clear evidence that such a transformation happened. Unlike Tutankhamun, whose changed name and reign were useful to the restoration, Meritaten disappears into the gaps. Perhaps she had already died before the return fully unfolded. Perhaps she was pushed aside after the death of Smenkhkare or the end of a short-lived Amarna succession. Perhaps she lived quietly under altered circumstances, no longer useful to official memory. Scholars still debate the possibilities, but the silence is striking because she had once been so visible. The restoration also created a new problem for memory. It was not enough to revive Amun. The regime had to decide what to do with Akhenaten. At first, the handling may have been cautious. Immediate successors could not entirely deny their connection to him, because the royal line still passed through Amarna. But over time, especially under later rulers such as Horemheb, the Amarna kings were treated as illegitimate or omitted from certain king lists. Monuments were dismantled, blocks reused, names attacked, and the official sequence of kings was repaired as though the uncomfortable interval had not happened. in that repaired memory, Meritaten had little place. Her importance depended on a world later Egypt wanted to compress into silence. And yet the return toward Amun did not completely erase her. It only made her harder to see. The old gods came back. Tutankhamun's name became famous for reasons no one in his court could have imagined. The priesthoods recovered. The royal art moved away from Amarna's elongated forms. The city in the desert emptied beneath the same sun that had once sanctified it. But fragments remained names, titles, scenes, altered inscriptions, traces of a princess whose life had been caught between the making of a new world and the repair of an older one. Meritaten stands at the point where restoration becomes erasure. Egypt returns to Amun not simply by changing prayers, but by changing memory. And in that changed memory the beloved of the Aten begins to fade. Meritaten vanishes from history in the way many powerful people vanish in ancient Egypt, not all at once, not with a clear final sentence, but by losing the conditions that once made her visible. As long as Akhenaten's court needed her, her name appeared in the light. As eldest daughter, she helped complete the sacred image of the royal family. As great royal wife, she stood beside the uncertain machinery of succession. But once Egypt began to turn away from the Aten, once the city of Akhenaten lost its purpose, and once later rulers found it useful to smooth over the entire Amarna episode, Meritaten's presence no longer served the official story. The result is not a clean death notice. It is a fading. A title stops appearing. A name ceases to be repeated. A princess who had once stood beneath the sun's hands slips into one of the most frustrating silences of the 18th dynasty. The first thing to understand is that disappearance from the record is not the same as disappearance from life. Ancient evidence is uneven by nature. A royal woman may stop appearing in inscriptions because she died, because her political role ended, because monuments were never completed, because later rulers destroyed or reused them, or because the surviving material comes from the wrong places. The evidence remains incomplete, and Meritaten's case sits exactly inside that uncertainty. She may have died during the late Amarna period, perhaps not long after her elevation. She may have survived into the early restoration and been removed from public memory because her identity was too closely tied to Akhenaten's failed order. She may have lived under reduced status in a court that no longer wished to display her. Scholars still debate these possibilities because no securely identified tomb, mummy, or final inscription has settled the question. That lack of a known tomb is especially haunting. Egyptian royalty invested heavily in death, burial, and remembrance, yet Meritaten's final resting place remains unknown. Akhenaten prepared a royal tomb in the eastern cliffs of Amarna, and members of the royal family were associated with it. But the final use of that tomb and the later movement of royal remains are complicated matters. The royal tomb at Amarna preserves scenes of mourning and family loss, but it does not give Meritaten a simple ending. It is possible that some members of the Amarna family were first buried in the city, and later moved when Akhenaten was abandoned. It is possible that burials were disturbed, unfinished, or relocated into Theban context during the restoration. It is also possible that Meritaten's burial was modestly preserved at the time, but later lost through destruction, reuse, or robbery. No single explanation fully accounts for all the missing pieces. The broader pattern of Amarna burials shows how unstable the period became after Akhenaten. Royal bodies and burial equipment may have been moved, reworked, or reassigned. Objects originally made for one person could end up serving another. Names could be changed. Coffins could be altered. Funerary goods could cross from one identity to another in ways that make modern reconstruction difficult. Tutankhamun's tomb, though much later famous as a dazzling discovery, contains objects that may reflect this world of reuse and adaptation. The late Amarna court seems to have operated under pressure, and burial preparations were not immune to that pressure. In such conditions, Meritaten's own funeral record could easily have been absorbed into the confusion. There is also the problem of royal memory after Amarna. If Meritaten remained associated with Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Smenkhkare, or the disputed Nefertiti, then later regimes had little reason to preserve her clearly. The restoration under Tutankhamun began the turn away from the Aten, and later rulers pushed the rejection further. Horemheb and the early 19th dynasty worked to repair the official image of kingship by treating the Amarna period as a kind of break in proper order. Akhenaten's name was attacked. Amarna blocks were dismantled and reused. The old sequence of kings was reshaped. In this atmosphere, Meritaten's identity was inconvenient. She was not just any princess. She was the beloved daughter of the heretic king and the radiant queen of the Aten city, perhaps also the queen of a short-lived ruler whose memory offered no stable future. Her disappearance may therefore be partly deliberate. That does not mean every missing inscription was personally targeted, or that a dramatic purge chased her name from every wall. Erasure in ancient Egypt could be systematic, opportunistic, or simply practical. Blocks from abandoned buildings were valuable construction material. Names of disfavored rulers could be cut away because memory itself had political force. Later builders might reuse stone without caring about the individuals once honored on it. Time then completed what politics began. Wind, salt, breakage, looting, and excavation history all shaped what survived. Meritaten's silence is the product of many processes layered together: ancient ideology, royal restoration, physical abandonment, and the ordinary cruelty of preservation. The human fate behind that silence remains unknowable. If Meritaten died young, her death may have been folded into the larger losses of the royal family during a period already marked by uncertainty. If she lived longer, she may have watched the city of her childhood empty, and the religious language of her life become dangerous or useless. It is possible that she moved with the court away from Amarna, perhaps to Memphis or another royal centre, and passed into a quieter existence no longer recorded in monuments. It is also possible that her position beside Smenkhkare ended quickly and left her politically exposed. These are not certainties. They are cautious paths through a broken record. What survives in the record suggests importance followed by silence, but it does not tell us whether that silence began with death, displacement, demotion, or deliberate forgetting. This is why Meritaten is not a simple lost princess in the romantic sense. She is lost in a specifically historical way. Her disappearance reveals the limits of royal visibility. The same system that displayed her so vividly could withdraw her just as effectively. In childhood, official art made her part of the sacred family. In adulthood, titles placed her near succession. But once the political meaning of that family became dangerous, the machinery of representation turned away. The public image that had created her historical presence no longer had use for her. For a person in ordinary life, memory might survive through descendants, households, local stories, or burial. For a royal woman whose identity depended on official display, the collapse of that display was devastating. And yet, she does not disappear completely. Her name remains enough to trouble the surface of history. Meritaten survives in the stubborn fragments that erasure failed to finish inscriptions copied before they were lost, reliefs preserved in tombs, titles noticed by scholars, altered traces that still reveal the shape of what they tried to hide. Her absence has become part of her presence. The missing tomb, the unknown body, the uncertain final years, the silence after queenship, all of these create the outline of a life caught at the breaking point of a dynasty. Meritaten vanishes not because she was insignificant, but because she stood too near a world that later Egypt needed to forget. The beloved of the Aten was carried into history by sunlight, and then into mystery by the shadow that followed it. The clues to Meritaten's life do not survive in one place. They are scattered like pieces of a broken ceremonial vessel, each fragment preserving a curve of the original shape but never the whole design. To follow her after the main scenes of Amarna, one must look into tombs, damaged reliefs, reused blocks, altered names, and objects whose surfaces have been worked more than once. This is the world where Egyptology becomes almost detective work, not because the past is a puzzle invented for entertainment, but because the evidence has been cut, moved, repurposed, and sometimes deliberately silenced. Meritaten's name survives in a record that has been handled by devotion, politics, abandonment, restoration, and time. Every clue must therefore be read with caution. What appears at first to be a simple inscription may in fact be the final layer of several different decisions. The tombs of Amarna are among the most important witnesses. Cut into the cliffs east of the city, they belonged mostly to officials who served Akhenaten's court and wanted their afterlife bound to the new religious order. Their walls show royal reward ceremonies, worship of the Aten, processions, palace life, and scenes of foreign tribute. These tombs are not neutral reports. They are official self-presentations by people whose careers depended on royal favour. Yet that is exactly why they matter. They show what the Amarna elite believed it was valuable to display. In their carved and painted scenes, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and the princesses appear not merely as family members, but as the living centre of the world the officials hope to join forever. Meritaten's presence in these tombs confirms that she was part of the recognised public order of the regime. The royal tomb in the Amarna cliffs offers a more intimate and more troubling kind of evidence. It was intended for Akhenaten and members of his family, and its decoration includes scenes of royal mourning that have drawn enormous attention. The tomb is damaged, and its interpretation is difficult. Some scenes are usually connected with the death of Smenkhkare, Meritaten's sister, though the exact details remain debated. What matters here is the way the royal family's private loss becomes a public sacred image. Even grief appears under the rules of court representation. Figures gesture, mourn, and stand in formal relation to the royal dead, while the larger framework remains that of a dynasty and divine order. The evidence remains incomplete, but the tomb shows that Amarna's royal family was not just a theological symbol, it was a household marked by real loss, translated into the language of kingship. Meritaten's absence from a secure burial context is therefore even more striking. A princess and queen of her rank should, in theory, have left clearer funerary traces. But the late Amarna period was not a stable time for funerary planning. Tombs may have been unfinished, burials may have been moved, equipment may have been reassigned, names may have been altered. The city's abandonment meant that anything prepared at Amarna could later become inconvenient, vulnerable, or useless. If Meritaten was buried there, her burial may have been disturbed when the court withdrew. If she was buried elsewhere, the later rejection of Amarna may have obscured or destroyed the identifying evidence. No single explanation fully accounts for her missing tomb, but the absence fits the wider disorder of the age. Erasures tell another part of the story. In ancient Egypt, names were powerful. To carve a name into stone was to give it a form of endurance. To damage or remove a name was not merely vandalism, it could be an attack on memory itself. Akhenaten understood this when the names and images of older gods, especially Amun, were suppressed during his reign. Later rulers understood it as well when they attacked Akhenaten's memory and dismantled the monuments of his city. The Amarna period became a battlefield of names. Some were elevated, some were replaced, some were cut away. Meritaten's story survives inside this atmosphere of written power, where a chisel could change the future's ability to remember. The reuse of blocks adds a further layer of difficulty. Buildings from Akhenaten's projects were dismantled after the restoration, and their stones were often reused in later construction. This practical act had an accidental gift hidden inside it. Blocks buried within later walls sometimes preserved Amarna scenes that might otherwise have been destroyed completely. Yet reuse also tore images out of context. A face, a hand, a name, or part of a royal body might survive while the surrounding scene vanished. Scholars must reconstruct original compositions from fragments that were not meant to be read in isolation. Meritaten can appear in this record as a partial figure, a title, a name beside another name, a trace of rank whose full setting has disappeared. Altered inscriptions involving Kia, Meritaten, and other royal women show how actively the court revised its own memory even before later rulers condemned Amarna. This is one of the most revealing details. Erasure did not begin only after the old gods returned. Within Akhenaten's own royal world, names and images could be changed as status shifted. Kia's monuments, in some cases, seem to have been adapted for Meritaten or for other princesses. Such changes suggest that royal identity was being reorganized in real time. The court was not simply recording a stable family, it was managing a hierarchy under pressure. Scholars still debate the exact sequence and meaning of these alterations, but their existence shows that Amarna's visual world was less serene than it appears at first glance. Objects connected with the late Amarna period deepen the problem. Coffins, shrine panels, jewellery, vessels, and funerary items can carry signs of reuse or altered ownership. Some objects from Tutankhamun's burial equipment have long been studied for possible connections to other royal figures, including the confusing final rulers of Amarna. These clues are technical and often disputed, but they reveal a court where death, succession, and material preparation may have moved faster than tradition preferred. If a ruler died suddenly, if a burial had to be assembled quickly, or if political legitimacy shifted, objects could be adapted. The evidence remains incomplete, yet the pattern of reuse makes Meritaten's vanished burial less surprising. In such a world, even royal death could become administratively improvised. The challenge is that erasure can be mistaken for evidence of drama more easily than it should. A damaged name does not always prove hatred. A reused object does not always prove conspiracy. A missing tomb does not always prove a violent end or secret burial. Time breaks things. Later builders recycle materials. Tomb robbers damage surfaces for value rather than ideology. Excavation histories can scatter objects far from their original contexts. Responsible history must resist the urge to turn every gap into a sensational claim. What survives in the record suggests political rewriting and instability, but not every missing piece can be explained by deliberate destruction. Still, The pattern is powerful. Meritaten belongs to a family whose monuments were attacked, whose city was abandoned, whose religious language was reversed, and whose memory was later compressed into silence. Her clues are difficult because the world that preserved her also became the world that needed her forgotten. The tombs show her importance. The erasures show the danger of that importance. The reused blocks show how memory can be broken and accidentally saved at the same time. The altered names show that identity at Amarna was not fixed, but negotiated through power. In the end, the physical record of Meritaten is like Amarna itself, bright, damaged, revealing, and incomplete. A tomb wall gives one glimpse, a title gives another. A replaced name opens a hidden passage into court politics. A missing burial leaves a silence that cannot be forced to speak. Through these fragments, she remains neither fully present nor fully gone. She is caught in the material afterlife of a failed revolution, where stone remembers what kings tried to correct and sand protects what history almost lost. The clues do not solve her completely. They do something quieter and perhaps more haunting. They prove that she was once central enough to be carved, altered, reused, and erased, and that even erasure could not remove her entirely. Meritaten's legacy is not the legacy of a ruler whose monuments still dominate a valley, nor of a queen whose tomb gave back gold, linen, and a face to the modern world. Her legacy is quieter and more difficult. It lives in the places where the record nearly fails. It lives in the carved name that survives after the wall around it has broken, in the title that places her beside power without explaining the cost, in the family scenes where she appears beneath the Aten's rays before the history around her darkens. She's remembered not because Egypt preserved her lovingly, but because Egypt could not erase her completely. That is a different kind of survival, and in many ways a more fragile one. To understand Meritaten is to understand the strange afterlife of Amarna itself. Akhenaten's city was intended as a permanent sacred horizon, a clean beginning in the desert, a place where the visible sun disk would order religion, kingship, art, and daily life. But permanence is one of history's favourite illusions. The city lasted only a short time. Its temples were abandoned, its palaces fell into ruin, its royal family was pushed into uncertainty and then into silence. Yet because the experiment failed so quickly, it left behind a sharply outlined wound in the record. Amarna was not absorbed smoothly into centuries of rebuilding. It remained recognizable as a brief, intense interruption. Meritaten belongs to that interruption, and her memory cannot be separated from it. She also forces a gentler correction to the way ancient history is often told. The story of Amarna can easily become the story of Akhenaten alone, the strange king, the religious reformer, the so-called heretic, the man who moved Egypt's capital and challenged old gods. Nefertiti, too, has become a figure of fascination, often through the beauty of a single famous image. Tutankhamun became immortal by accident, because his tomb survived in a way almost no royal tomb did. Meritaten stands between these better-known figures. She is the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, possibly the wife of Smenkhkare, perhaps connected to the final struggle over succession, and an elder sister in the same family world that produced Tutankhamun's restoration. Her life reminds us that history is not only made by the names that become famous, it is also made by those who hold the structure together for a moment and then disappear when the structure collapses. What survives in the record suggests that Meritaten's importance changed with the needs of the court. As a child, she represented divine favour and dynastic promise. As the eldest daughter, she gave visible order to the royal family. As great royal wife, she may have helped stabilize a fragile succession. If the disputed late Amarna rulers involved a female figure close to kingship, Meritaten's place becomes even more charged, whether or not she herself ever ruled. Scholars still debate the precise sequence, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern is clear enough to matter. Meritaten was not peripheral. She stood close to the centre in a period when the centre was breaking. That closeness explains both her visibility and her disappearance. A minor figure can sometimes survive because no one bothers to erase her. A central figure in a discredited regime is more vulnerable. Meritaten's name carried the Aten. Her public life was built by Akhenaten's sacred family imagery. Her adult status appears to belong to the uncertain final years of that regime. When Egypt returned toward Amun, and later rulers repaired the official memory of kingship, Meritaten had little place in the story they wanted to tell. She was too Amarna to be useful, too visible to be harmless, and perhaps too closely connected to failed succession to be preserved clearly. And yet she remains. That is the quiet triumph of fragments. Later kings could dismantle buildings, reuse blocks, omit names, and reshape official history. But they could not control every broken surface that would one day be read again. They could not foresee archaeologists studying relief fragments, comparing titles, tracing altered inscriptions, and asking why one princess appears so often, then vanishes so sharply. Meritaten's survival is not full restoration. It is a flicker, but even a flicker can disturb the darkness. There is a human tenderness in that. Behind the titles was a person born into one of the most intense royal households of the ancient world. She likely knew the shining courts of Akhenaten, the formal movements of ritual, the presence of Nefertiti, the authority of Akhenaten, the noise of palace life, the repeated images of the Aten's rays falling upon her family. She may have watched her world change from certainty to strain, from sacred experiment to political crisis. We cannot know her private thoughts. No single explanation fully accounts for her final fate. But the absence of her voice does not make her unreal. It only reminds us how much of the ancient past was lived fully and recorded partially. Meritaten also gives Amarna a different emotional shape. Without her, the story might seem like a clash of ideas, Aten against Amun, reform against tradition, new art against old convention. With her, the story becomes a family history, with flesh and uncertainty inside it. A story of daughters placed under divine light and then asked, perhaps, to help carry the weight of a collapsing throne. Meritaten is not only an emblem of a failed religion, she's a reminder that royal ideology was lived by actual people, people whose names could become prayers, whose images could become doctrine, and whose futures could be shaped by decisions made before they were old enough to understand the full danger of them. The most enduring mystery is not simply where she was buried, or whether she briefly stood closer to kingship than the surviving evidence can prove. It is how a person so publicly displayed could become so difficult to find. Meritaten's life sits at the edge of what ancient evidence can do. It can show status, but not interior life. It can preserve ceremony, but not private grief. It can name a daughter, a queen, a beloved of the Aten, but it cannot easily tell us what happened when the city emptied, when the court turned away, when the old gods returned, and when the horizon that had defined her world became just another desert ruin. That is why she remains powerful. Meritaten does not answer every question. She keeps the questions alive. Through her, the Amarna period becomes more than a strange episode of theology. It becomes a meditation on memory itself, who receives monuments, Who loses them? Who is allowed to become part of official history? And who survives only because the erasure was imperfect? Her legacy is not certainty. It is the shape left by uncertainty around a life that once mattered deeply. In the end, Meritaten is remembered as a figure caught between family, faith, power, and erasure. She was born into a city that believed the sun had chosen it. She stood beside parents who tried to reorder Egypt's relationship with the divine. She grew up in art that made royal intimacy into sacred law. She became important enough for titles that still trouble scholars. Then she disappeared into the damaged passage between Amarna and the Restoration. The desert did not give her back whole. It gave back fragments, and those fragments are enough to make her visible, not as a solved mystery, but as one of the most haunting human traces of Akhenaten's vanished horizon. The desert at Amarna is quiet now. The sun still rises over the eastern cliffs, but it no longer rises for Akhenaten's city. It falls on broken walls, on pale dust, on stones that once carried names with the confidence of eternity. The river still moves below, green and patient, as it moved before the Aten temples were built and as it moved after they were abandoned. Nothing in the landscape hurries to explain itself. The horizon remains, even after the kingdom that named it sacred has gone. Meritaten remains there in a different way, not as a statue standing complete in a museum hall, not as a queen whose tomb can be entered step by step, but as a presence made from pieces, a beloved daughter beneath the sun, a princess in a city of light, a royal woman near the final pressure of a dynasty, a name that later memory did not fully protect and later erasure did not fully destroy. Her story is fragile because most human stories are fragile. Even kings vanish. Even cities built by command fall silent. Even gods who seem to fill the sky can lose their temples when history turns. But disappearance is not the same as nothingness. Something remains when a name is read again after thousands of years. Something returns when a broken relief is studied, when a title is noticed, when a vanished woman is placed carefully back into the world that once shaped her. The recovery is never complete. It should not pretend to be. The ancient dead do not owe the present easy answers. They leave traces, and the traces ask for patience. Meritaten's life widens into that larger truth. Civilizations remember unevenly. Time preserves some things by accident and destroys others with perfect indifference. A palace floor may survive as fragments while a human voice disappears forever. A carved title may outlast the body that carried it. A city built to worship light may become most powerful in ruin, when the light falls across emptiness and lets us feel how much has passed beyond reach. And so, the lost princess of Amarna lingers at the edge of vision. She stands where the desert meets the river, where devotion became politics, where family became monument, where memory broke but did not vanish. The sun lowers, the cliffs darken, the city grows still again, and somewhere in that stillness, Meritaten remains not fully found, not fully lost, a small bright name surviving in the long shadow of ancient Egypt,